My very first night back at my father-in-law's suburban house. The porch light flicked off. It dragged this thick, suffocating blanket of pitch-black darkness over every single corner of the property. It drowned the entire space in this chilling, skin-crawling silence. And standing there in the dark, this incredibly bizarre feeling washed over me. It felt safely comforting, but also wildly reckless, like I was balancing right on the jagged edge of a cliff. My husband, Hunter, he'd taken a job overseas literally right after our wedding. It was only supposed to be a 6-month stint, but then the pandemic blew up, commercial flights got cancelled, delayed, and finally suspended indefinitely. I was stuck, stranded in the city all by myself for 2 agonizing months. Our tiny apartment, the one we'd rushed to buy before the wedding, suddenly morphed into this hollow, freezing little box. It chilled me right down to my bones. My own parents lived states away. My mom's chronic arthritis was flaring up, so she couldn't exactly handle a cross-country road trip to check on her newlywed daughter. That summer hit with a suffocating, miserable heat wave. The city was rolling out endless power blackouts. And to make things completely unbearable, my apartment building's plumbing system totally shut down for emergency repairs. Right when I was at my absolute lowest, feeling completely abandoned and exhausted, Arthur called. My father-in-law. His voice was deep, steady, and rumbled through the phone speaker. He told me to pack my bags and come out to the suburbs. He said there was no point in me suffering alone in the city. His house was massive, and he was just aimlessly wandering the empty halls, going out of his mind with boredom. That house hadn't felt a woman's touch since my mother-in-law passed away. There was no one to talk to. No home-cooked meals simmering on the stove. I hesitated for a long time. My knuckles turned white gripping the phone. Deep down, there was this unspoken, awkward boundary between a daughter-in-law and her husband's family. But the crippling loneliness, it just ate away at me until it won. I quietly packed a single duffel bag. I caught the late-night bus, desperate to escape the suffocating city. Arthur's house sat way back on a sprawling, secluded suburban lot. It was totally surrounded by overgrown bushes of white chrysanthemums. They were my late mother-in-law's absolute favorite flower. The second I dragged my suitcase through that rusted iron gate, a massive gust of wind hit me. It carried this raw, earthy, sickly sweet scent of chrysanthemums. It shoved its way right up my nose, chilling me to the core. That smell mixed with the heavy, damp scent of the afternoon rain. It made the air feel thick, like a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. I just stood awkwardly on the front porch. I clutched my little bag, feeling this hollow, twisting loneliness that I couldn't even put a name to. Arthur hurried out of the kitchen to meet me. He had this warm, gentle smile on his face. He was so used to living like a ghost for years after his wife died, but he still carried himself with that protective, attentive energy of a classic patriarch. He'd carefully set up a bedroom for me on the ground floor. It was actually the old guest room Hunter and I had shared during the chaotic days right after our wedding. The room was incredibly basic, but spotless. There was just a dark oak wardrobe, a tiny vanity, and a massive window looking straight out into that sea of white chrysanthemums. Arthur's bedroom was tucked way away at the absolute end of the hallway, right next to the kitchen. To get from my room to his, you had to walk through the main living room. You had to walk right past the family shrine. That physical distance felt perfectly safe. We each had our own distinct, totally separated zones. Arthur carried my bag inside. He gently told me to make myself at home. If I wanted to cook something, the kitchen was mine. If I wanted fresh air, I could go pick flowers in the garden. I just ducked my head, nervously whispering my thanks. I was deeply grateful. But I also felt like a total stranger. Like an unwanted tenant awkwardly trespassing in my husband's childhood home. Right in the center of the main room, my mother-in-law's memorial portrait sat flawlessly on the wooden altar. Her painted eyes looked like they were quietly, strictly watching every single movement in that house. It was this invisible, suffocating moral pressure, just crushing the oxygen out of the room. It wasn't until I laid down on that unfamiliar mattress on my very first night that I realized I'd made a massive packing mistake. The only sleepwear I'd stuffed in my bag was a sheer, paper-thin silk nightgown. It was the kind of thing I wore in the private, climate-controlled bubble of my city apartment. I'd completely forgotten that the suburbs get freezing and violently windy at night. I slipped the thin fabric over my body. The frictionless silk clung tight to my skin, outlining every single shiver and goosebump. I yanked the heavy wool blanket all the way up to my chin. I squeezed my eyes shut, desperately trying to force myself to sleep. But my brain was screaming. The darkness out here wasn't diluted by streetlights like back in the city. It was incredibly thick. It was pitch black. And it felt violently heavy. Just outside my door, the ancient ceiling fan in the living room started to grind. The blades chopped through the air, dragging out this hollow, rhythmic creak. Creak, 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 and where? It echoed through the dead silence. It sounded exactly like a grim reaper's clock, just ticking away the seconds, hunting me, pounding straight into my eardrums. The night wind sliced through the tiny cracks in the window frame. It blasted into the room, carrying that sickly sweet white chrysanthemum smell. Mixed with the rotting scent of damp, ancient wood. Suddenly, every single one of my senses dialed up to an extreme, terrifying level. I laid there holding my breath. I listened to the slow, heavy footsteps of my father-in-law pacing around the brick patio outside. The rough scratch of his slippers scraping the dirt. The quiet, metallic click of the gate latch closing. The loud, dragging screech of a wooden patio chair moving across the concrete. Every tiny, mundane sound became agonizingly sharp. It felt like those sounds were physically brushing against the nerve endings under my skin. I tossed and turned, staring at the ceiling. I thought about Hunter. I thought about how our rushed, chaotic marriage had blown past me like a blurry gust of wind. We hadn't even been married for 3 full months. And the total number of days we'd actually spent in the same room could be counted on 2 hands. I felt exactly like a spectator standing on the absolute sidelines of my own happiness. I was just barely breathing, waiting around for some imaginary, magical fix that was never coming. Hunter felt so impossibly distant right now. All he'd left me with was the legal title of a wife, a painfully empty bedroom, and this massive, suffocating tumor of loneliness rotting inside my chest. And right then, lying awake in the dark. It was the very first time I actually felt my father-in-law's crushing isolation. He was this profoundly gentle, deeply patient man who'd swallowed his own grief for years. He'd lost his wife way before they even got to grow old together, and now he was just reduced to staring out at bleak sunsets, hiding in the pitch-black corners of this massive, empty house. The pale moonlight bled through the window blinds. It projected Arthur's shadow onto my thin bedroom wall. He looked so broken, so completely defeated. And for some bizarre reason, my heart actually skipped a beat. Looking at his shadow, it felt like we weren't just 2 distant strangers bound by marriage anymore. In the suffocating darkness of this domestic prison, we were just 2 completely abandoned humans, 2 desperately lonely souls craving basic warmth, but forced to wear this heavy, suffocating armor of family morality. I reached up, and softly ran my fingers over the freezing, slippery silk hanging off my shoulder. I wasn't some naive, brainwashed little girl. I sure as hell wasn't going to sacrifice my 20s on the altar of good wife loneliness. Deep down, I felt this quiet, venomous pride, a slow-burning resentment toward the twisted cosmic joke that locked me in this dead-end void. I strained my ears. I heard Arthur's footsteps stop dead on the porch. He was standing right against the wall of my bedroom. Then, I heard it, a heavy, gut-wrenching sigh from an exhausted older man. It melted right into the rhythmic squeak of that ceiling fan. I tried to lie to myself. I told myself this was just a temporary bunker for a few weeks, that it would blow over, and absolutely nothing would change. But staring into the dark, breathing in that haunting, sickeningly sweet flower smell. The second I heard his chest rattle with that sigh, I knew right then that every single safe, moral boundary we had was already starting to aggressively crack. I didn't wake up until the morning sun was literally baking the tops of the trees outside. Last night was a brutal, suffocating blur of chaotic, pointless nightmares. I finally dragged myself out of the bedroom. I made absolutely sure to wrap a thick, long-sleeved cardigan tightly over my sheer silk nightgown. The house felt way more open and bright in the daylight, but that thick, suffocating cloud of sheer awkwardness was still rotting in every single corner. Arthur had been up for hours. He was hunched over in the courtyard, aggressively sweeping up dead leaves from the storm. Breakfast was an absolute nightmare of suffocating silence. We both just stared blindly into our bowls of takeout noodles. Neither of us dared to say a single word. All I could hear was the harsh clack of bamboo chopsticks hitting porcelain. I heard him swallow hard, his throat clicking in the silence. And above us, that damn ceiling fan just kept spinning. Creak, 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 watching us like an invisible warden. This suburban house looked massive from the outside, but the walls were rapidly closing in with every breath I took. I started hyperfixating on tiny, intimate details I'd never even noticed before. The little beads of sweat collecting on Arthur's forehead when he scooped his rice. The frantic, jerky way he'd rip his eyes away from me if I even accidentally glanced in his direction. The smell of his cheap drugstore soap mixed with the damp, earthy, raw scent of sweat soaking his faded collar. It was the scent of an older, rugged man. It was unpolished. It was intensely raw. But it felt so insanely, wildly safe. My psychological radar was redlining. I realized I was getting sucked into this dark, twisted game of psychological cat and mouse. And the terrifying part. I didn't even know the rules. Late that afternoon, the blistering heat just instantly collapsed. These massive, bruised-looking black clouds aggressively rolled in over the bamboo trees. They swallowed the sun like a giant, suffocating blanket. The wind started violently shrieking through the rotting wooden window frames. It ripped the flimsy curtains right up to the ceiling. A massive, brutal summer hurricane was slamming into us with zero warning. The rain hit like a physical wall of water. It violently smashed against the tin roof on the back patio. The power lines blew instantly. The entire house plunged into this sickly, grey, apocalyptic twilight. I panicked. I sprinted out into the backyard, where my laundry was still hanging on the line. The violent wind whipped these massive, freezing sheets of water straight into my face and neck. I was only standing in that torrential downpour for maybe 5 seconds. But my thin shirt was instantly, completely drenched. The soaked fabric aggressively suctioned itself to my skin. It completely exposed the freezing curves of my body, violently shivering from the sudden temperature drop. I frantically grabbed huge armfuls of wet clothes. I hugged them tightly against my chest, desperately scrambling back toward the porch. But the torrential rain had turned the old, mossy brick steps into an ice rink. The exact second the ball of my foot hit the top stair, my shoe totally lost traction. My leg violently shot forward. I flailed my arms, completely dropping the wet laundry. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the agonizing, bone-crushing impact of my spine smashing into the solid concrete. But that impact, it never came. A massive shadow lunged straight out of the kitchen with this explosive, primitive survival instinct. Arthur threw his entire body forward. His thick, muscular arms violently wrapped around my waist. He aggressively yanked me backward just a split second before my body could smash into the steps. It was a completely destructive collision. A physical crash that instantly pulverized every single moral, psychological wall we'd spent so long building. Everything around me just instantly flatlined. The deafening roar of the rain on the concrete, the wind screaming through the doors. It all just got sucked into this massive, terrifying vacuum of silence. Time physically froze. The only functioning piece of reality left in my brain was the burning sensation on my soaking wet waist. His hands were unbelievably rough. They were totally calloused from decades of hard labor. And those thick, sandpaper calluses were aggressively grinding directly into the paper-thin silk plastered against my skin. A scorching, suffocating heat transferred straight from his palms into my freezing body. It burned like glowing charcoal. It was violently, aggressively primitive. A total, blinding contrast to the freezing hurricane ripping around us. I could feel every single one of his knuckles violently digging into my ribs. He was using every ounce of his terrifying strength just to keep me from falling. But the crushing pressure of his fingers wasn't just holding me up. It was carrying the explosive, violent rage of physical desires he'd kept chained up for decades. My body was completely crushed against his chest. Even through his soaking wet shirt, I could feel his heart detonating. It was hammering so fast, so violently hard. It felt like a wild, rabid animal trying to bash its way out of a steel cage. His breathing just entirely stopped right above my head. He was choking on his own oxygen, panting, desperate, the blazing hot air out of his mouth blasted right against my ear. I could smell the stale, rotting tobacco. The bitter tea. That sharp, wild, overpowering scent of raw male sweat, all violently tangled with the sweet smell of my soaked hair. In that frozen, suspended slice of time, every generational gap, every single moral law of the universe, was totally incinerated by body heat. This suffocating, skin-to-skin collision left absolutely no room to hide. I slowly tilted my head up. Our faces were literally inches apart. Rainwater was violently cascading down his forehead, tracing the deep wrinkles around his eyes. I stared straight into the terrifying, bottomless black pits of his pupils, and in that one tiny split second, I didn't see the dignified father-in-law. I didn't see the respected patriarch. All I saw was this massive, blazing fire of desperate, starving lust. It was frantic. It was agonizing. It was completely feral. That raw starvation had been locked inside the suffocating chains of his family duty. It was chained up by the smiling portrait of his dead wife sitting right there in the living room. And right when our burning eyes locked, this incredibly dark, deeply manipulative instinct aggressively woke up inside of me. I didn't step back. I didn't pull away. I just went entirely limp. I purposefully let the entire, heavy weight of my soaking wet body sink deep into his rock-solid arms. It was a completely calculated, venomous display of weakness. The intoxicating power of being the vulnerable one violently surged through my veins. I realized it. This incredibly powerful, deeply respected man was physically trembling while holding my dripping wet body. He was completely terrified of himself. The massive tumor of guilt was ripping his chest wide open. But the gravitational pull of his own primal biology was aggressively locking his hands in place. He couldn't let go. It was like he had both hands wrapped around a glowing hot stove. 10 agonizing seconds dragged out like an entire century. Then, he violently snapped out of it. A massive, deafening crack of thunder ripped the sky in half. It shredded the hallucination and aggressively dragged him back to our cruel reality. He panicked. He ripped his hands off me so violently, pushing me with such terrifying force that I stumbled backwards and smashed my shoulder into the wooden doorframe. Crack. His face went sickly, completely pale. It was pure horror. He stumbled backward one step, then two. He aggressively averted his eyes, physically turning away from my body like I was some kind of rabid monster. His chest was violently heaving, sucking down air like a drowning man. He didn't ask if I was hurt. He didn't apologize. He didn't say a single word. This massive, powerful man just cowardly turned his back on me. He practically tripped over his own feet, sprinting down the pitch-black hallway. He violently slammed his bedroom door shut. Clack. The heavy iron deadbolt slid into place. It sounded so hollow and dry over the deafening roar of the rain. That cowardly, desperate sprint was the loudest, clearest confession he could have ever made. Our moral walls weren't just cracked. They were completely, violently obliterated. I just stood there alone on the empty porch. I was totally soaked. Freezing rainwater dripped off the hem of my thin nightgown, staining the tile floor. My hair was plastered to my freezing cheeks. But deep down inside my chest, this twisted, intoxicating, demonic fire had officially caught the wood. I slowly turned my head. I stared back into the dark living room, straight at the family altar. The gloomy, grey storm shadows made my dead mother-in-law's portrait look totally blurred and distant. But the grandfather clock on the wall just kept ticking. Tick, tock, counting down the seconds to the deeply toxic, wildly intoxicating psychological war that was about to begin. I slowly bent down and picked up my soaking wet laundry. The corner of my lips slowly curled up into this exhausted, but deeply, incredibly provocative smirk. This house, this suffocating, moral prison, had finally exposed its fatal flaw. I wasn't the sad, lonely victim anymore. I'd just seen the absolute, crippling weakness of my prey. The morning sunlight blasted through the blinds, lighting up the dust violently swirling in the air. I woke up late. My body was totally exhausted. But my mind was completely, terrifyingly wired. I laid there fixating on his cowardly sprint down the hallway last night. That panic, it wasn't funny to me. It felt exactly like a key turning in a rusty lock. It was the sound of his repressed, suffocating desires violently cracking open. I finally walked out of my room, stepping incredibly light on the floorboards. Arthur was desperately trying to build a massive, invisible wall between us. He was outside in the sweltering heat, aggressively sawing up scrap wood. The screeching of the metal blade was deafening. He was literally using that violent, ear-piercing noise to drown out the panicked heartbeat ripping through his chest. Lunch was absolutely suffocating. You could have sliced the tension with a machete. He kept his head down, aggressively shoving rice into his mouth. His ears were burning red. He wouldn't even risk a single, accidental glance in my direction. Watching this powerful, intimidating patriarch completely cower in my presence, it planted this dark, twisted sense of power in my brain. I realized something huge. I wasn't the pitiful, abandoned little daughter-in-law anymore. I was holding his fatal weakness in the palm of my hand. I was officially running this dark, psychological game. By late afternoon, that brutal summer heat was suffocating the house again. The air was incredibly thick. It smelled like sticky tree sap, stale sweat, and damp, rotting wood. The ceiling fan in the living room was just lazily spinning. Creak, creak, ticking away like a death clock, just waiting to judge our sins. I decided to take a cold shower. Standing under the freezing water, I let the dark, venomous thoughts totally consume me. Hunter, my actual husband, had completely abandoned me in my prime. This family trapped me with a marriage certificate, fed me lies about being a dutiful wife, and then locked me in a void. That tumor of resentment, violently tangled up with raw, primal desire, started growing these dark, suffocating tentacles. When I stepped out, I didn't put my usual conservative clothes back on. I opened the old closet and grabbed one of Hunter's massive, oversized white dress shirts. It swallowed my tiny frame. I purposely left the top 2 buttons completely undone. It totally exposed my pale collarbone, and the soft, heavy rise of my chest through the thin fabric. The hem draped low over my hips, completely bare legs exposed underneath. I didn't even touch a towel to my hair. I let it hang in soaking wet, heavy strands over my shoulders. Freezing drops of water kept dripping down, instantly soaking into the white shirt. The wet fabric aggressively clung to my skin. It was this totally calculated, incredibly explicit exposure, completely disguised as a lazy, innocent accident. I walked barefoot out into the living room. Arthur was sitting in the heavy mahogany chair. He was nervously rereading yesterday's newspaper, his reading glasses slipping down the bridge of his nose. My bare feet didn't make a sound on the tiles, but the heavy scent of my shampoo, violently mixed with the smell of my damp, warm skin, hit him instantly. The newspaper physically trembled in his massive hands. He slowly looked up. The exact second his eyes hit my soaked, oversized shirt, his jaw completely locked. I watched his Adam's apple aggressively bob up and down as he choked on his own spit. I played it totally dumb. I casually strolled right past him toward the antique tea cabinet. The physical distance between us was barely 2 steps. The entire room went into slow motion. I went up on my tiptoes, stretching my arms high above my head to grab the tea tin. The movement violently hiked the oversized shirt up. It completely exposed the back of my bare thighs in the dim afternoon light. The silence in the room was deafening. I could hear his heavy, ragged, open-mouth breathing directly behind my back. Smack! The newspaper dropped flat onto the wooden table. His focus had completely, violently snapped. I slowly turned around. I hugged the tea tin against my chest, purposely exhaling a long, soft breath into the dead silence. My eyes locked directly onto his. His pupils were totally blown out. Deep red, bloodshot veins were frantically pulsing in his eyes. He was fighting a desperate, agonizing war against his own feral instincts. Right above us on the altar, the portrait of my mother-in-law smiled down. It was a forgiving smile, but it was brutally stabbing the last remaining shreds of his conscience. The fan just kept judging us. Creak, creak. I walked over and gently placed the tea on the table. But I didn't step back. Instead, I slowly bent over right in front of him to pick up his dropped newspaper. The loose collar of my wet shirt completely fell open. The raw, heavy pulse of a deeply lonely woman was just inches from his face. His hands violently gripped the armrests. The thick blue veins in his arms were bulging, physically shaking under the pressure. I looked up at him through my wet eyelashes. I gave him this incredibly vulnerable, deeply tragic look. And then I finally shattered the suffocating silence. My voice was soft, almost dripping with poison. It's so suffocatingly hot, Arthur. I'm trapped in this house all day. It makes me want to tear the walls down. Hunter's been gone forever. Sometimes I wonder why I even got married, when I'm just left to suffer through the lonely nights entirely by myself. I took a slow breath, stepping an inch closer. You've lived exactly like this for years. Don't you ever just crave basic warmth? Don't you ever desperately want someone to just touch you? Every single word was a toxic dagger, slicing straight into the fatal, bleeding wound he'd hidden for half his life. It was a wildly provocative test, a lit match thrown directly into his dry, rotting soul. His eyes blew wide open in absolute horror. He opened his mouth, but the words totally choked in his dry throat. He looked frantically up at his dead wife's picture, and then back down at my soaking wet, shivering body right next to him. The psychological torture was physically twisting his face. He aggressively shoved himself backward, pressing his spine into the chair. He desperately tried to create physical space. His hand frantically swiped the table, accidentally smashing into a cold cup of tea. The dark liquid aggressively spilled all over the expensive wood. His total panic made me feel incredibly, sickeningly powerful. I didn't back off. I took a half step forward. The blistering heat radiating off my skin blasted right into his face. I slightly tilted my head, exposing my bare, pale neck, just waiting for him to violently snap. His dying conscience threw one last, pathetic punch. He violently jumped to his feet. The heavy wooden chair shrieked against the tile floor. He aggressively wiped his sweating face, desperately trying to force his strict, fatherly tone back into his voice. But it came out shaking, hoarse, and totally broken. Put some clothes on. The doors are wide open. If the neighbors see you like this, they'll think we're animals. Hunters working overseas for your future. Don't let your mind wander into the gutter. You're a married woman. Act like it, and wait for your husband. Those moral lectures in a room dripping with raw lust. And it just exposed how incredibly fake his armor was. He was yelling at me, but he couldn't even look me in the eye. Sweat was violently soaking through the back of his shirt. He was using those harsh, rejecting words as a pathetic shield for his own disgusting urges. But he didn't realize. The harder he fought me, the more he exposed his crippling weakness. I quietly took a step back. A tiny, toxic smirk creeping onto my lips. I didn't argue. I just bowed my head, playing the submissive, apologetic victim. But I knew the poison arrow had already hit his heart. This wasn't a cage anymore. It was a gladiator arena. And I'd officially started the hunt. That suffocating tension choked the house for 2 solid days. He completely avoided me. He'd leave before the sun came up, and wouldn't return until pitch black. But that physical running didn't fix his rotting soul. I knew he was drowning in the mud of his own desires. His silence wasn't disgust. It was the silent, agonizing scream of a man desperately clinging to the edge of a cliff before the fall. On the 3rd day, a massive tropical depression slammed the coast. The sky turned violently black right at noon. A brutal, raging hurricane tore through the neighborhood. Freezing floodwaters swallowed the front steps. The house became this totally isolated, pitch-black island. No power, no sunlight, no cars, just the violent shriek of the wind ripping through the walls, and the deafening roar of rain on the tin roof. It was the absolute perfect incubator for our rotting psychological tumors to finally burst open. Right at dusk, a massive gust of wind snapped the backyard tree in half. A heavy branch smashed straight into the kitchen window. Crash! The deafening sound of shattering glass ripped through the dark. I dropped my book and grabbed a tiny flashlight, sprinting toward the kitchen. In the sickly, yellow beam of light, I saw Arthur. He was hunched over, frantically picking up razor-sharp glass shards from the soaked floor. The freezing hurricane wind was blasting through the broken window, violently soaking the entire back of his shirt. In his total panic, a massive, jagged piece of glass violently sliced right across his right palm. Dark, thick blood instantly poured out. It dripped directly into the freezing rainwater puddles on the floor. He hissed in pain. He desperately grabbed his hand, but the blood just kept gushing through his thick fingers. I didn't say a single word. I walked right up to him, set the flashlight on the counter, and I aggressively grabbed his wrist. The sudden, physical touch violently shocked him. He tried to rip his arm away like a pure survival reflex, but I locked my fingers completely around his thick, vascular wrist. It was a firm, suffocating grip. I absolutely wasn't taking no for an answer. I dragged him into the living room and forced him down into the wooden chair. My voice was dead calm. An irresistible, soft command. Sit still. I'm getting the first aid kit. You're bleeding everywhere. If it gets infected, you're done for. He didn't fight back. He just slumped his massive head down, his heavy, ragged breathing drowning in the hurricane outside. I came back with the kit and lit a single, small candle on the table. The flickering flame violently danced across his hollow, exhausted face. I pulled up a tiny stool, sitting intimately close. Our knees were practically brushing. I gently placed his bleeding, massive hand onto a clean white towel. The room violently shrunk down to just that tiny circle of candlelight. The slow-motion camera kicked in again. I opened the rubbing alcohol and soaked a bright white cotton ball. My hands were freezing, soft, and completely pale. A total contrast to his massive, rough, boiling hot palms. When that alcohol hit his open flesh, his entire body violently convulsed. It wasn't just the physical sting. I could feel every single muscle in his arm completely lock up. This dark, intoxicating electrical current shot straight up his spine the second my fingers brushed his palm. The metallic smell of fresh blood violently mixed with the sharp alcohol. It tangled with his heavy, raw male sweat, and the soft perfume on my wrists. Every single layer of our defense was violently ripped away. I leaned my face in dangerously close. So incredibly close that my loose hair brushed directly against the back of his hand. It created this agonizing, teasing friction. My soft breath fanned directly across his bleeding skin. His massive chest violently heaved. I could hear him painfully swallowing dry air. I could hear his heart exploding against his ribcage under his soaked shirt. "Does it hurt, Arthur?" I whispered the question without even looking up. I just kept slowly, meticulously wrapping the white gauze around his massive hand. That question was loaded. I was asking about the physical cut, but I was probing straight into his rotting, agonizing soul. He was dead silent for a long time. The tension was thick enough to choke on. And then, like a dam violently bursting under pressure, his moral fortress just instantly collapsed. A shattered, pathetic sigh ripped out of his throat. He didn't pull his hand away. He just let it rest entirely in my grip. His voice was completely destroyed, raspy, broken, and dripping in absolute despair. "This pain. It's nothing, Chloe. For 20 long years. Ever since Hunter's mother died, I've been walking around half dead. I tried so damn hard to be the perfect father. The flawless, moral patriarch. I violently locked away every single desire. Every selfish emotion. I locked myself in this empty tomb of a house, lying to myself that raising my son was enough. But I'm flesh and blood, Chloe. How the hell am I supposed to turn into a piece of stone?" His confession poured out like a ruptured artery. He buried his face in his good hand. His massive shoulders violently shook with pathetic, broken sobs. He wasn't the powerful, threatening father who'd screamed at me yesterday. He was just a desperately lonely, shattered man, starved of basic human touch for decades. "I'm terrified, Chloe. Do you get that? I'm absolutely terrified of myself. Every time I see you rotting here all alone. Every time I smell your scent in my house. I feel like this disgusting, predatory animal. I desperately want to protect you. I want to hold you. But my own morality is suffocating me. Hunter's a terrible husband. He abandoned you. But he's still my flesh and blood. The guilt is eating me alive. I just want to smash my head into a wall to make it stop." His words aggressively slammed into my brain. My cold, manipulative armor, totally cracked. I thought I was controlling a puppet. But this puppet had a violently real, agonizing soul. A deeply painful, bleeding empathy suddenly sprouted in my chest. We were both victims of this toxic house. Of Hunter's invisible chains. Arthur buried his youth to be a father. I was burying my 20s to be a ghost wife. His dark past aggressively mirrored my empty present. It violently erased the entire generational gap between us. I stopped wrapping the bandage. I slowly looked up at him. Real tears were streaming out of the deep wrinkles around his eyes, shimmering in the candlelight. It aggressively struck the deepest, most compassionate nerve in my body. I didn't want to play the twisted power game anymore. Totally on instinct. I gently lifted his freshly bandaged hand, and softly pressed it against my own pale cheek. It wasn't a seductive, sexual move. It was absolute, raw comfort. The desperate connection of two lost souls violently shivering in a massive storm. He froze. His entire body went completely rigid. And then, he slowly exhaled. His bandaged fingers clumsily, deeply cherished the skin on my cheek. Our eyes locked. No walls. No defenses. Just this agonizing, bleeding understanding of two people carrying fatal wounds. Outside, the hurricane violently screamed. Lightning shredded the pitch-black sky. But inside that tiny kitchen, time completely stopped. Tonight, human morality was violently bowing down to human suffering. We just sat there in the dark, letting the physical heat from our hands silently confess what we couldn't say out loud, marking the start of a tragic, fatal collision that was inevitably going to destroy us both. The hurricane wasn't slowing down at all. It was day 4. Grey, sickly light was bleeding through the window. That bloody, deeply emotional connection we shared last night, it was supposed to bring us closer. But it actually just lit a massive, terrifying fuse inside Arthur's brain. He was absolutely terrified of his own weakness. That massive moral wall he spent 20 years building, it completely collapsed from one single touch of my hand. This morning, the house was suffocating. The tension was stretched so tight it felt like a piano wire ready to violently snap. Before the sun was even fully up, I heard this violent, deafening hammering. It was coming from the backyard. The rain was still aggressively pouring down in heavy sheets. But Arthur, he didn't care. He was totally shirtless, just wearing these worn-out, soaked shorts. He was standing right in the middle of this freezing, torrential downpour. Desperately trying to fix the collapsed tin roof of the old chicken coop, he was swinging that heavy metal hammer constantly, smashing it down with this brutal, terrifying, aggressive anger. His right hand, the one I'd so carefully bandaged the night before, was completely soaked in freezing rainwater. The violent impact ripped the wound right open. Thick, dark blood was violently gushing out. It rapidly soaked the bright white gauze until it turned completely red. He wasn't fixing the roof. This was blatant, physical self-harm. He was aggressively punishing himself, using agonizing physical pain to drown out the sick, suffocating lust burning inside his brain. I quickly threw on a thin jacket. I walked out to the porch, just quietly watching this man violently destroy himself. The freezing rain whipped right into my face, but that dark, manipulative fire inside my chest, it was dancing wildly. I knew he was desperately running away, but when you corner a wild animal, it usually bites. I stepped down onto the slick, mossy bricks. I waded right into the freezing, ankle-deep floodwater. I reached my hand out, trying to gently touch his bleeding arm. "Arthur, come inside. You're bleeding again. Are you trying to literally rot your own arm off out here?" I made my voice sound so incredibly soft, so purposely heartbroken. But he didn't give me that shattered, vulnerable look from last night. He violently yanked his arm back. He aggressively hurled the heavy iron hammer straight into the muddy floodwater. The filthy, brown mud violently splashed up, completely staining my clean white shirt. He whipped around to face me. His eyes were completely bloodshot, bulging with these terrifying, red veins. He looked like a feral, trapped beast. That suffocating tumor of guilt was completely crushing his throat. So he grabbed the absolute most cowardly weapon he had. Verbal abuse. "Get your hands off me. Don't you ever touch me," he roared. his raspy voice literally drowning out the thunder. That rejection, it was freezing cold. It totally severed that fragile, intimate thread we'd just spun. He aggressively pointed his bleeding, bandaged hand right in my face. His massive chest was violently heaving. "Look in the damn mirror. Your husband's away. And you parade around your father-in-law's house half naked, dressing like a cheap tramp. What the hell are you trying to pull in my house? I'm Hunter's father. Do you want to smear complete shit all over this family? Do you want the whole neighborhood calling me a sick animal? Stay the hell away from me. The second this storm breaks, you pack your bags and get back to the city. I won't house a shameless, disgusting woman." Those vicious insults poured out like freezing acid. They were as sharp as needles, stabbing straight into my face. He used the most vile, degrading words possible to totally crush my pride. He desperately needed to push me away. He wanted me to be horribly hurt. He needed me to hate him. Because hatred was the only thing that could rebuild that massive wall between us. But he completely miscalculated. I wasn't some naive, fragile little girl who'd just collapse and cry over getting yelled at. The intoxicating power of the victim violently activated again. I didn't step back. I didn't run inside crying. I planted my feet right in the freezing mud. I tilted my chin up, letting the brutal, heavy rain smash into my face. I stared dead into his terrified, shifting eyes, the corner of my mouth slowly curled up. A bitter, incredibly toxic, deeply calculated smirk. Hot tears mixed with the freezing, salty rainwater on my cheeks. "You're calling me a tramp. You're calling me shameless." My voice wasn't loud, but it was razor-sharp, pinning every single word right into his eardrums. I took a slow step forward, totally destroying the physical distance. Then who exactly was the man holding my hand last night? Who was the man looking at me like he was starving to death? How much longer are you gonna lie to yourself, Arthur? You're screaming at me just to hide your own disgusting cravings. You're violently punishing yourself out here because you're absolutely terrified you won't be able to stop yourself from grabbing me. Aren't you? Those words were like a pot of boiling water violently dumped over his fragile shell. His face completely contorted in agonizing, humiliating pain. The strict pride of a father, the intimidating aura of the patriarch. I ripped it all away. I stripped him totally naked in the freezing storm. My words were absolutely lethal. They violently demolished his entire logical defense system. The psychological push and pull just violently peaked. He stood there violently panting. He stumbled back a step. And then he aggressively lunged at me. Both of his massive, rough hands violently clamped down on my shoulders. His grip was so brutally tight, I actually thought my collarbones were going to snap. His bleeding right hand completely soaked right through my thin, wet shirt, transferring this burning, fiery heat and the sickly sweet smell of fresh blood directly onto my skin. He violently shook my shoulders, aggressively growling from the bottom of his throat. "Shut your mouth. Shut up right now. You're aggressively driving me to my death. Do you even realize that?" But despite those violent, terrifying threats, his body completely betrayed him. The physical space between us was literally zero. The slow-motion camera violently kicked back in, peeling back the layers of this terrifying boundary. I could feel the blistering heat radiating off his bare, muscular chest, blasting straight against my freezing, shivering body. His heartbeat was frantic. Thump, 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 smashing against my own chest, creating this wild, synchronized rhythm. His heavy, ragged breathing was violently panting right above my head. The raw, sharp scent of male sweat. The metallic tang of fresh blood. The damp, rotting smell of the storm. It all violently tangled with the sweet shampoo in my hair, morphing into this lethal, intoxicating drug. The feral animal inside him violently woke up, completely crushing the rational man. He stopped pushing me away. Those brutal hands gripping my shoulders, they slowly loosened. They slowly slid all the way down my arms, turning into this secret, trembling caress. His burning, ragged breath ghosted right against my ear. I slowly closed my eyes. I tilted my head back, willingly accepting this violently tragic downfall. His lips slowly brushed against my soaking wet cheek. It was agonizingly tender, deeply starving. The massive tumor of guilt totally vanished. There were just two starving animals, violently crashing into each other in the freezing floodwater. Right at the exact split second his burning, dry lips were about to crash into my shaking mouth, right when the absolute last shred of morality was about to be violently ripped apart. Ring. 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 The old landline in the living room aggressively shrieked. It was this sharp, mechanical, ear-piercing scream echoing through the empty house. It violently sliced through the deafening storm, completely shattering that heavy, suffocating cloud of lust. It just kept screaming. Relentless. Unforgiving. It wasn't just a normal phone call. It was the violent, physical presence of reality. It was Hunter. My absent husband. His own flesh and blood son. It was the ultimate, ruthless judge, slamming its gavel right down on our rotting souls. That deafening, mechanical shriek was like a massive volt of electricity violently shocking his brain. Arthur's eyes blasted wide open. His pupils were totally dilated in absolute, sickening horror. That intoxicating fog of lust was instantly, violently blown away, replaced by pure, crippling terror. He panicked. He violently shoved me away from his chest. The force was so aggressive, I literally lost my footing and crashed backward into the filthy, muddy water. He violently grabbed his own head, stumbling backward in these long, uncoordinated steps. The phone just kept aggressively screaming, sounding exactly like the universe violently mocking us. He didn't even look at me once. He just cowardly turned his back and sprinted for his life back into the house. The heavy wooden door violently slammed shut right in my face, locking his cowardice and his screaming conscience safely inside. I just sat there alone in the freezing rain. My body was completely covered in filthy mud. Listening to that cursed, haunting phone ring over and over again, my lips couldn't even form that twisted, victorious smirk anymore. Because in this sick, psychological war, it felt like we had both just completely lost everything. The phone finally stopped screaming. That dead, mechanical sound just faded out, handing the silence right back to the brutal, roaring summer hurricane. I slowly dragged myself up from that freezing puddle of thick mud. I hauled my heavy, exhausted legs up the brick steps to get back inside. The house was completely drowned in this suffocating, pitch-black darkness. The whole city grid was dead. The rainwater from the porch was rapidly rising. It was violently spilling right under the front door, dragging all these rotting leaves and garbage across the dark tile floor. The dead silence inside those walls was a total, jarring contrast to the violent storm outside. But that silence? It was holding a terrifying, explosive power. Way worse than the hurricane. I just stood there in the dark, wringing the filthy, muddy water out of my sheer, paper-thin shirt. My eyes were totally locked on Arthur's closed bedroom door. He was hiding, he was desperately running away. But the hurricane outside wasn't gonna let him stay safe inside his cowardly little bubble. Suddenly, a massive, violently aggressive gust of wind slammed into the house. It shrieked with this deafening pitch like silk being violently ripped apart. Right after that, a terrifying, explosive crash erupted from the back of the house. A massive branch from the ancient tree got twisted off by the wind. It violently smashed straight through the tin roof of the storage shed attached to the kitchen. It dragged an entire section of the old brick wall down with it. A thick, suffocating cloud of brick dust violently exploded into the air, totally blending into the white sheets of freezing rain. Arthur's bedroom door violently blasted open. He sprinted out into the hallway. His face was completely, utterly terrified. He was gripping that dim, flickering little flashlight. The sickly yellow beam frantically swept across the totally destroyed kitchen. He didn't even look at me. He just violently screamed over the deafening wind. The water's flooding everything. The roof isn't gonna hold up. Get down into the root cellar right now. Move. Beneath the floorboards of the back addition, there was this tiny, cramped root cellar. They used to use it to hoard heavy sacks of grain and old, rotting furniture. In this totally desperate, life-or-death moment, raw survival instinct violently crushed all the awkwardness. It completely buried the moral boundaries we'd just ripped apart. I didn't even have a second to process it. I frantically sprinted after his heavy footsteps. Arthur used his one good arm, aggressively pushing alongside my hands, to slide the massive, heavy wooden trapdoor out of the way. Instantly, this freezing, suffocating blast of dead air hit my face. It smelled heavily of rotting mildew, damp earth, and dead pests. It shot straight up my nose, making me physically gag. We scrambled down those incredibly steep, dangerously slick concrete stairs. The space down there was suffocatingly tiny. It was barely even 2 arm lengths across in any direction. This place was entirely cut off from the outside world. It was as suffocating, airless, and terrifying as a sealed coffin. The exact second my toe hit the very bottom step, a violent mini-tornado blasted through the house above us. The massive, heavy trapdoor got violently ripped off balance by the wind. It violently slammed shut right over our heads. Bang! The rusted iron latch violently crashed into place, jamming completely tight. Every single trace of that dim, grey light from above was instantly, violently severed. The cellar was plunged into this thick, heavy, absolute pitch black. It was so completely dark, you couldn't even see your own hand waving an inch in front of your face. The ancient flashlight in Arthur's hand suddenly flickered. It weakly pulsed 2 times, and then completely died. In that suffocating, hypercramped space, there was nothing left but absolute darkness. The muffled, heavy rumble of thunder vibrating the ceiling. And the desperate, ragged sound of 2 people aggressively fighting for oxygen. I frantically waved my hands around in the pitch black, desperately trying to back up and find the wall. But the space was just way too small. The second my bare back hit the freezing, rough, mossy brick, my chest violently crashed right into Arthur's massive, burning hot torso. The physical distance between us was completely, entirely erased. Arthur violently flinched. He desperately tried to crush his own spine against the opposite wall. But no matter how hard he tried to contort his massive frame, the suffocatingly tiny space physically forced our bodies together. It forced our skin to aggressively rub against each other. It was this forced, agonizingly slow, inescapable collision. There was absolutely nowhere to hide. The slow-motion camera in my brain violently kicked on again. It aggressively peeled off the very last layer of our moral defenses. I could clearly, vividly feel the blistering heat radiating off his bare skin. It was burning straight through my soaking wet shirt. There were 0 air vents in that tiny cellar. The temperature started violently skyrocketing just from the body heat of 2 humans. It wasn't the freezing cold of the rainwater anymore. It was this suffocating, claustrophobic, bone-dry heat. The oxygen was rapidly vanishing. His heavy, pouring sweat was seeping out of him. It aggressively mixed with the rotting smell of mud and the metallic tang of fresh blood from his hand. It created this ferociously wild, intoxicating drug. It was aggressively waking up the absolute most primitive, animalistic instincts buried deep under his human mask. Arthur exhaled a heavy, ragged breath. Streams of blistering hot air blasted directly against my collarbone. His massive chest was violently heaving up and down. Every single time he inhaled, his skin aggressively brushed against my freezing, shivering chest. Against these wild, unspoken cravings I was feeling. He desperately raised both of his arms. He planted his massive hands flat against the brick wall right behind my back. He was desperately trying to use his own arms to build a cage. Trying to build a flimsy physical barrier so he wouldn't actually hold me. But his thick arms were violently shaking. Trembling out of control. Was he shaking from physical exhaustion? Or from the violent, sexual impulses aggressively ripping his brain apart? Only he knew. I didn't pull away. This absolute pitch-black darkness. It was the perfect velvet curtain. It completely hid us from the cruel, judging light of our own conscience. I knew he was using every ounce of strength to fight the temptation. He'd just rejected me in the storm. He'd just used those vicious, toxic words to publicly humiliate me. But locked inside this tiny, suffocating cage, every single weapon he had was totally useless. I slowly, deliberately tilted my face up, my lips softly, agonizingly brushed directly against his rapidly bobbing Adam's apple. It was just a tiny, microscopic graze, light as a butterfly brushing the surface of a lake, but it triggered a massive, terrifying psychological earthquake. A choked, agonizing groan ripped straight out of the bottom of his throat. It sounded exactly like the pathetic cry of a wounded animal violently caught in a steel trap. The thick muscles in his arms completely locked up. They were flexing so violently hard, I thought his veins were going to literally burst open. He was desperately, pathetically trying to hang on to the last shred of his sanity. "Don't. Please don't do this." His voice was barely a whisper. It was completely broken. Begging, and gasping for air. That rejection sounded so incredibly pathetic. So fragile, and completely, utterly helpless. He was begging me to stop, but really, he was desperately begging himself not to completely cave in. But I had totally mutated into a cold-blooded predator. All that pain, all those vicious insults he hurled at me. They'd turned me into this deeply calculating, venomous fire. I wanted to violently rip that fake, moral mask right off his face. I wanted to forcefully prove to him that when it comes to primal biology, morality is just cheap, useless jewelry. In that thick, suffocating darkness, I slowly slid both of my arms up. I wrapped them completely around his rock-solid waist. I pulled my arms tight, completely engulfing his massive, sweat-soaked back. I rested my chin heavily on his shoulder. I leaned in, and I whispered these dark, intoxicating words right into his ear. "Stop lying to yourself, Arthur. Down in this cellar. There's absolutely nobody to judge us. There's no hunter. There's no dead wife. There are no neighbors watching. It's literally just you and me. Hold me, Arthur. I'm so freezing cold." Those words were the absolute final drop of water. They violently shattered a cup he'd been suppressing for decades. It aggressively smashed the thickest, strongest moral wall inside his brain. Every single chain of logic just violently snapped. The deafening thunder exploding outside couldn't even cover up the violent sound of our morality completely shattering. He dropped his arms from the brick wall. And then, he violently ripped them back around me. He aggressively crushed me against his body. It was an embrace that literally crushed our ethics into dust. It was feral, brutally rough, and deeply desperate. He squeezed my fragile frame against his massive chest, exactly like a drowning man violently clinging to a piece of driftwood, clinging to my body just to survive the flood. His terrifying strength completely swallowed me whole. It violently squeezed every ounce of air out of my lungs. His rough, calloused hands aggressively tangled into my soaking wet hair. He forcefully shoved my face deep into the crook of his neck. Our breathing violently crashed together, chaotic, wild, entirely out of control. He aggressively buried his face right into the open collar of my sheer shirt. He frantically ground his rough, prickly stubble into my freezing skin. His burning hot tears were violently spilling out. They dripped down, trailing all the way down my bare shoulder. It was a complete, devastating collapse. An unconditional surrender to the most feral, wild animal instincts. Down in the dead silence of that cellar, with zero light, and absolutely no room to breathe, we violently melted into each other in this blazing, skin-on-skin collision. Everything else in the universe just completely vanished. All that existed was the heavy smell of sweat, the chaotic, ragged gasping, the slick, wet friction of our soaked clothes violently rubbing together, and the frantic, explosive beating of two hearts aggressively obliterating every single taboo. He was biting his lip so hard, desperately trying to swallow his own moans, but his massive hands just kept violently squeezing my waist tighter, like he was trying to physically carve my body directly into his own bones. The agonizing tumor of his guilt was totally incinerated, burned into absolute ash by this blazing fire of lust. The dignified, moral patriarch was completely dead, replaced by this wild, starving, desperately lonely man begging for warmth. We were sinking so incredibly deep into this black hole of desire, just floating right on the jagged edge between ultimate euphoria and absolute, disgusting depravity. We didn't give a damn how brutally the cold light of tomorrow was going to judge us. In the suffocating thickness of that deep cellar, Messer, time physically warped, it stretched out into these thin, snapping threads. Every single concept of physical space, of human ethics, of societal chains, they were entirely pulverized under the crushing weight of that feral embrace. The massive world outside was violently screaming through a hurricane. But inside this tiny, 2-foot cage, a totally different storm was raging. one that was 1,000,000 times more destructive. It was violently ripping down the very last fortress of his sanity. My father-in-law, a man who spent 20 grueling years building this flawless, unbreakable moral armor, was now violently shaking, completely collapsing under the absolute most primitive instinct known to man. I squeezed my eyes totally shut, fully bathing in this dark, intoxicating victory of the weak. That tumor of guilt crushing his chest. It felt like it had entirely melted under the blistering heat of our skin. He was squeezing me so violently hard. I could literally hear my ribs giving these tiny, terrifying pops. The oxygen down there was already completely gone. But now it was incredibly, agonizingly suffocating. We were just frantically panting, two people completely losing their minds. His lips were aimlessly, blindly tracking up my skin, pressing aggressively into my neck, violently grinding his rough stubble against my shivering skin. Every blistering exhale blasted straight into my ear, carrying that sharp, sour smell of sweat, the metallic reek of fresh blood from his bandaged hand. And this bottomless, crushing despair. In that intoxicating, euphoric blur. I actually thought I'd completely, totally manipulated him. I thought this cage keeping my 20s hostage was finally shattered, making room for the darkest, most feral rebellion. I wrapped both arms entirely around his massive back, my fingers aggressively clawing into his wet, sweaty skin. I was totally, completely ready for the point of no return. But right on that absolute final boundary, to right at the exact split second his dry, cracked lips were about to crash into my shaking mouth, this invisible lightning bolt violently struck us. It wasn't the deafening thunder outside. It wasn't the heavy trapdoor bursting open. It was a single, boiling hot, incredibly salty tear. It fell from his eye, crashing onto my cheek. It slid all the way down, and violently shattered right at the corner of my lips. That single tear. It carried the entire, crushing weight of a moral courtroom. It was a lit match aggressively tossed onto a massive mountain of dynamite buried in his brain. The slow-motion camera violently froze this brutal, unforgiving moment. I could physically feel every single muscle in his body instantly, violently turn to stone. That chaotic, feral breathing just abruptly stopped. It violently choked in his throat. His eyes blasted open in the pitch black. And even though I couldn't see anything, I could feel the blinding, crippling horror violently radiating off his face. This brutal awakening slammed into him with zero warning. It was freezing cold, and as sharp as a butcher's knife violently stabbed through his chest. The image of Hunter, his own flesh and blood, slaving away overseas. The image of his dead wife's forgiving smile on that altar. They all violently rushed back at once, aggressively choking him. That tumor of guilt hadn't vanished at all. It was just waiting for the absolute weakest, most vulnerable second, to violently rip his soul into a million bloody shreds. He violently flinched. It was the terrified, full-body shock of a man who just nearly stepped off a massive cliff. With zero warning, he used every ounce of terrifying strength in those rough hands. Even the bleeding one. He aggressively, violently shoved me completely off his chest. The force was so brutal, so horribly absolute. In that suffocatingly tiny cellar, I had nowhere to fall back. My spine violently smashed into the rough, mossy brick wall behind me. Thud. A sickening, dry crack echoed in the dark. This blinding, agonizing pain shot straight up my spine into my skull. But that physical pain, it was absolutely nothing compared to the terrifying psychological explosion detonating in my brain. The shift from that blazing, feral heat to this freezing, brutal reality happened in a microsecond. The bloody emergency brake of logic was aggressively yanked right at the edge of the cliff. Arthur violently scrambled backwards. He desperately crushed his massive frame against the opposite wall, trying to create the absolute maximum distance in a space that was barely 3 feet wide. His gasping wasn't fueled by lust anymore. It was the panicked, hyperventilating wheeze of a man who just barely escaped a tiger's jaw. "You're out of your mind. We're both completely, entirely out of our minds." His voice was violently shaking. Hoarse. Completely shattered into pieces. The darkness was swallowing us whole. But every single word he spat out was blindingly bright. They were as brutal as thousands of steel needles violently stabbed into my eardrums. I was totally paralyzed. I couldn't even draw a single breath. I was completely, utterly shell-shocked by this violent flip. Just seconds ago, this man was crushing me in his arms, crying. He took a massive, violently deep breath, sucking in all the dead air left in the cellar. And when he spoke again, the panic was aggressively shoved down, replaced by this freezing, bitter, unimaginably cruel life sentence. I'm Hunter's father. For the rest of my life. Until they put me in the ground. I'll always be your father-in-law. You're too damn young. You've got your whole life ahead of you. I understand how lonely you are. I see your pain. But I won't let you use it to destroy yourself, or drag this family's honor into the dirt. I'd rather take my own life with my bare hands. Tenemone, than turn into some feral animal. A permanent stain that can never be washed away. That rejection was pure steel. It didn't leave a single microscopic crack for me to crawl through. He was using his own vicious cruelty to protect me. Or more accurately, to protect that rotting moral code he worshipped. He completely rejected my seduction by violently degrading the raw feelings we just shared. He threw that fake, dignified armor back on. But this time, that armor was stitched together with both of our blood and tears. You're crying because you're lonely. You're craving this because of some primal instinct of an abandoned wife. But it isn't love, Chloe. It's just a cheap, impulsive mistake. I'm an old man. I can carry a bad reputation. But I'll absolutely never let you cross this line. If you have a single drop of self-respect left, if you even view me as a human being, forget everything that just happened. Pretend that tonight we both died. Every single sentence was a machete, violently hacking down the intricate web I'd spent days spinning. I desperately wanted to open my mouth and fight back. I wanted to scream that he was a coward, that he was brave enough to lust, but too pathetic to face it. But my throat was violently choked. Choking on the bitter, metallic taste of blood and total humiliation, being violently rejected right at the absolute peak of that climax. It was brutal. It was more degrading than 1,000 cuts. The calculating fire in my chest was violently snuffed out by a bucket of freezing reality. All that was left was this stinging, toxic smoke burning my eyes. I slowly slid down the brick wall. I collapsed right onto the freezing, damp concrete floor. I wrapped my arms aggressively around my shivering shoulders. I buried my face into my knees, and I just cried. Those uncontrollable, heavy sobs echoed in the pitch black, totally blending in with the deafening thunder outside. Those weren't tears of regret or acceptance. They were the tears of total, absolute helplessness. The tears of a shattered prey. Realizing the hunter just chose to slit his own throat to keep his fake dignity. Arthur didn't step forward to comfort me. He stood there like a hollow, dead stone statue. His absolute silence was the most terrifying weapon of all. It was violently cementing a boundary line that was just redrawn with blood and brutal resolve. Time dragged on like a heavy chain, violently crushing the broken pieces of our lost souls, after what felt like an entire century. The rain outside finally started to die down. The wind wasn't screaming like a demon anymore. Arthur slowly turned around. He reached his massive arms up, aggressively shoving against the heavy trapdoor above us. The rusted iron latch violently fought him. But under the pure strength of his despair, it finally snapped open. A tiny crack appeared. The sickly, grey, muddy light from the storm violently poured into the cellar. It beamed straight down onto two completely pale, hollow faces, covered in thousands of invisible, bleeding scratches. He walked up those concrete stairs first. He didn't look back a single time. His massive, lonely shadow was violently stamped against the grey sky. He looked huge, but so incredibly, pathetically pitiful. I stayed down in that dark corner for a long, long time. I let the freezing, bone-chilling cold violently seep into every single cell in my body. The bloody emergency brake had been pulled, the moral code had been violently saved. But I knew the absolute truth. A massive chunk of both our souls was going to stay down in that pitch-black cellar forever. Dead on arrival. Just violently rotting away in the most agonizing, brutal rejection of human life. The morning light was absolutely brutal. It violently tore right through those thick, grey clouds. It blasted these harsh, blinding rays of sun all over the destroyed garden. The hurricane was completely gone. It left behind this bright, totally spotless, suffocatingly quiet morning. I just zombie walked out of the bathroom. I stood there, letting the freezing cold water blast over my head, but it couldn't wash away that sickening, hollow humiliation. It was just aggressively rotting inside my chest. Last night, I literally crawled out of that pitch-black cellar like a ghost. I left a massive piece of my soul down there to die. Arthur wasn't even around. He'd locked himself in his room before the sun even came up. He violently slammed the door on his own mind, leaving me totally stranded in the wreckage of my own disgusting, toxic games. The house was terrifyingly quiet today. You could hear birds chirping out in the white chrysanthemums. You could hear the scrape of a bamboo broom on the patio. Arthur had been up for hours, just casually cleaning up the hurricane damage. I hid behind the window frame, quietly watching him. He was wearing this dark, perfectly pressed silk shirt. He looked massive, steady. Every single movement he made just screamed dignified patriarch. There was absolutely zero panic left. No ragged, heavy breathing, no bloodshot eyes staring at me like he was starving to death. The man who crushed me against his chest in that cellar, it was like he never even existed. He put that fake, moral mask back on. And it was so flawless, it was genuinely terrifying. His total, absolute calmness. It was a permanent death sentence to my pride. He was using that cold indifference to prove a point, to prove that I was just a bad dream. A tiny, dirty stain he easily wiped away before it could ruin his perfect life. At lunch, we sat directly across from each other at that heavy mahogany table. The tension wasn't thick with lust anymore. It was this massive, freezing, impenetrable wall of ice. Arthur picked up a piece of fish with his chopsticks and put it in my bowl. His movements were slow, deliberate, and his voice was so deep, so insanely distant, it made my throat close up. The storm's cleared out. The floodwater on the main road is totally gone. He didn't even look up. Pack your bags this afternoon, Chloe. Catch a bus back to the city. Hunter called this morning. His project is wrapping up. He's coming home in a few months. Go back and get the apartment ready. You've been apart for a long time. Make sure it feels like a home when he walks through the door. Every single word was painfully steady, perfectly polite. The exact, flawless tone of a caring father-in-law. There wasn't a single microscopic shake in his voice. No hesitation in his eyes. He used Hunter's name like a razor blade, reminding me exactly who I was, and exactly where I belonged in his house. The harsh daylight completely burned away that intoxicating, seductive fog we had in the dark. I just stared down at my bowl, shoving dry, tasteless white rice into my mouth. It physically felt like I was chewing on broken glass. I lost. It was a complete, humiliating, absolute defeat. That twisted power I felt, that toxic control, he just violently stomped it into dust under his heavy, moral boots. That afternoon, I quietly shoved all my things into my little duffel bag, those sheer silk nightgowns, the oversized white shirts. I violently balled them up, I aggressively shoved them to the absolute bottom of the bag, burying them, exactly like I was burying my own toxic, disgusting cravings. When I walked out onto the porch, Arthur was watering the white chrysanthemums. He slowly turned around, his eyes were completely blank. He just gave me this tiny, polite nod. Drive safe, Chloe. Call me when you get to the apartment so I know you made it. I froze right there on the steps. My heart was violently twisting in my chest. I desperately wanted to see something in his eyes. Just a tiny flash of regret. A hint of pain. Maybe even some weak, pathetic guilt. But there was absolutely nothing. His eyes were as flat and dead as a frozen lake. We said our polite goodbyes. Kept this huge, perfectly safe physical distance, but the second I turned my back to walk away, I knew the absolute truth. Behind that flawless, fake moral mask, buried deep in the absolute bottom of his soul, there's a forbidden scar. And it's going to bleed every single day for the rest of his life. The bus violently rattled down the highway, leaving the suburbs entirely behind, leaving that heavy smell of white chrysanthemums, leaving the man carrying a massive, suffocating tumor of guilt. I rested my head on the freezing glass, just watching the trees blur by. I didn't cry. My tears totally dried up in that pitch-black cellar. This bus ride was dragging me right back to my role. Back to the quiet, loyal, perfect wife. But my mind? It was permanently locked inside that suffocating, toxic cage. Time just kept dragging on. The months blurred together into this hollow, tasteless routine. And then, Hunter finally came home. The city apartment was suddenly filled with talking and laughing again. The warm, perfect family dinners. I played my part flawlessly. The sweet, obedient wife, cooking his meals, asking about his day. Everyone kept telling Hunter how incredibly lucky he was, praising me for being so patient, for waiting all alone for my husband to return. Whenever I heard those compliments, I just gave them this hollow, completely empty smile. Hunter would wrap his arms around me. He'd bury his face in my hair, inhaling my scent, whispering all these sweet promises about making up for lost time. But every single time he squeezed me, my body violently, subconsciously fought back. On the outside, I was hugging him back. But deep inside my brain, the slow-motion camera violently rewound the tape. I instantly flashed back to that blazing, raw heat coming off Arthur's bare chest. I remembered the harsh smell of sour sweat and fresh blood. I remembered that ragged, desperate breathing completely crushing against my ear. That raw, primal memory was violently burned into my nerve endings. It aggressively haunted every single restless, broken hour of my sleep. During the holidays, Hunter and I always drive back to the suburbs to visit. Arthur's getting a little older now. His hair's got more grey in it. He always greets us at the gate with that same, warm, gentle smile. In front of Hunter and the rest of the family. Arthur treats me perfectly. The absolute ideal, respectful father-in-law. I play right along. I call him Dad. I set up the altar for my dead mother-in-law. We perform this flawless, picture-perfect family play. But sometimes, we accidentally cross paths in a dark hallway. Or our eyes briefly meet when I hand him a cup of tea. It's just a fraction of a millisecond. Just a single blink. But it's enough. We both instantly see that bleeding, rotting scar hiding right under the skin. We have this unspoken, ironclad rule. We never talk about that night. We are never alone in a room together. But the psychological affair, it's violently happening every single day. Every single hour. It's just slowly, painfully chewing up the last tiny shreds of our sanity. So many nights. I wake up at 2 a.m. I listen to Hunter softly snoring right next to me. I just stare blankly at the dark ceiling, listening to the distant sirens out on the city streets. And I always ask myself, who's actually the villain in this tragedy? Was it Hunter, for completely abandoning me when I was young and vibrant? Was it me, for using cheap tricks to violently manipulate a man old enough to be my dad? Or was it Arthur, the man who used his fake morality as a shield? The coward who lusted after me, but ruthlessly shoved me off a cliff just to keep his hands perfectly clean. I used to violently hate him for pushing me away in that cellar. I hated his brutal, freezing rejection. But as the years dragged on, looking at the totally hollow shell of my own marriage, it finally hit me. His brutal decision that night. It was incredibly cruel. But it was the only emergency brake we had. It was the only thing that stopped us from completely, totally annihilating ourselves. If we had actually crossed that line, the guilt and the shame would have violently ripped us into a million bloody pieces. He purposely shattered my heart to protect me. He violently buried his own primal instincts alive, just so he could stay a real father. But the price we paid was way too damn high. We saved our reputations. We saved the family structure. But we completely, utterly lost our souls. We're dragging around this massive, suffocating sin that we can never confess. A rotting wound that can never be bandaged. Life just keeps moving on. It's loud, and busy, and perfectly normal. But in the deepest, darkest corner of my brain, Arthur and I are completely trapped together. We're two guilty prisoners, permanently locked in this invisible cage. Just silently choking on our own agonizing desire, until the day we finally die.